Well, that was a great intro.
That was a great intro. Holy cow.
Grab your drink. I didn't know if I had time enough to do it, but I got it.
Cheers, guys.
Yeah.
Cheers, everyone. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 now of Customer Experience Behind the Scenes. And if you're into acronyms, that is CXBS, but I always say in parentheses without the BS. This is where we try to dig below the surface of customer experience and consider how new ideas and techniques from maybe other disciplines can help us get better at what we do and love. I'm your host, Karl from Horizon CX, where we believe that customer experience management starts with mastering the fundamentals. And we help both individuals and organizations start off in the right direction through our CX Pro training and certification program that is offered in partnership with Question Pro. Speaking of Question Pro, I'm going to ask Mark Mandel from Question Pro to give us a brief snapshot of Question Pro.
Wow, what an opportunity. Thanks, Karl. And I'm Mark Mandel, as Karl said, from Question Pro. Happy to be here with you guys today. For those that may not know the company Question Pro, the way I like to explain who we are, it's really simple. Think of us as a interesting and maybe a little different than the norm customer experience technology company. We're a platform company built around kind of two cores that are coming together. And how I explain those cores, think of us as a term that we've coined, journey-based feedback. And this idea that you can take customer feedback platforms, VOC platforms, and now be able to bring them together with customer journey. And when you start to bring journey and feedback together, it unlocks a lot of really interesting things. Karl, if it's okay with you, I'd love to tell the team here a quick story around technology and relate it back to the conversation we're going to have, if that's all right.
We all love stories, Mark. So
let's make it personal. So for those of you who know me well, or for the last couple or a few years, you may remember there's such a thing as an old Mark Mandel and a new Mark Mandel, or a newer Mark Mandel. And the big difference between the old and the new, other than a few more gray hairs on my head, is the fact that about 3 years ago, I took on a bit of a journey to improve my health. And when I say my health, I mean my weight. I had been almost 285 pounds about 3.5 years ago. It got really out of control, and I went to the store when I tried to fix myself, and I bought a bathroom scale, and not just any scale. I bought a fancy scale, one that was digital. It could measure every which way and even tell me the weather when I stood on that scale. And it hooked up with a Bluetooth hookup to my phone. I got all the analytics on my phone and the charts and the graphs and all sorts of cool stuff. And I step on that scale religiously every morning when I got out of bed. And some mornings my weight was up a pound or two. Some mornings my weight was down a pound or two. And I used to joke to my wife that it looked like an EKG chart from a hospital. It was doop, 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 doop. And, after like a month of stepping on that scale every morning and seeing up a little, down a little, up a little, down a little, it dawned on me that the scale doesn't cause me to lose weight. It's a way to measure my progress. And the reality is, when I want to think back now on customer experience work, it's going to be an interesting parallel here. In order to get me to lose weight predictably, I had to change my behaviors. I had to eat differently, and I had to exercise a little bit, and I was able to lose almost 100 pounds. Thinking now about CX and voice of the customer, a lot of suppliers will come tell you that if you implement my software, their software, you'll have a better customer outcome. Nope, no differently than the scale will make you lose weight. The reality is you need to be prepared to think of customer experience improvement fundamentally rooted in change, culture change, process change. It's not just measuring it better. Think of your VOC platform as a little bit more than my bathroom scale. And it's a way to measure and assess how you're doing. It's part of the means. It's a tool in the toolbox, but it should never be confused with the ends. Just as the scale is not going to get me to lose weight, your VOC is not going to improve your customer experience. if you could think about change and think about how we're going to make culture different, process different, people different, that's what we're going to be here. And specifically, Karl and Gary are going to be here to talk about on this call. And I hope that that's okay that I shared a little bit of a story in that metaphor with you. So with that, Karl and Gary, it's your show. I'm here to help any way I can.
All right. Got your coffee cup there, Mark. Thank you for that. That's a good story. And it's true, right? It's the behaviors behind the technology that make a difference. And that's why we do that when we teach CX Pro. It's all the behaviors behind the technology that you're using. Today, I'm excited to have my guest on this program, Dr. Gary David. Gary is a professor of sociology at Bentley University here in the Boston area. And he's a certified applied and clinical sociologist. We'll find out more about what that means in just a minute here. I've known Gary for several years. We first connected, I believe, through the Customer Experience Professionals Association. And we both have a passion for people and experiences, whether that's customers, employees, patients, students, and particularly those aspects of experience that focus on the humanistic qualities, versus the mechanical and technological. It's well known that experiences will happen, whether you intentionally design them or not. And when you don't design them and leave them to happenstance, you never know what you're going to get in return. But we also know that in doing nothing is certainly not the best strategy. And to help with strategies in designing human experiences, we have social science as one source of help for us, but the phrase, maybe we don't know what we don't know, might best apply here. So with that, let me introduce to you Professor Gary David. Welcome to the program, Gary.
Thanks, Karl. Good to be here.
So to get us started, and for the benefit of those that are unfamiliar with you and your areas of expertise, why don't you give us a summary of your work? And I'm particularly interested in knowing exactly what a certified applied and clinical sociologist is all about.
Well, let me, if you give a professor that much leash to please explain how much time do we have? I'll try to keep it brief. Going back to my early work in my dissertation, back when I was a baby, going back to my dissertation work, it was ironically or interestingly focused on intercultural communication, what we would call service encounters. This was just after the Rodney King verdict, for those old enough to remember, the tumult that occurred at immigrant-owned stores in many urban areas where there was this sense of exploitation or disconnection or lack of opportunity, where immigrant-owned businesses that might be liquor stores or convenience stores or grocery stores were seen as not doing a service to the community and rather extracting money from the community and not giving good service in return. So being from Detroit, I was living in Detroit at the time. I'm also Arab American, and most of the liquor stores and grocery stores in Detroit were owned by people from the Arab world. So I started focusing on that, and I became much more interested in how people built relationships across the counter. Because most of the time when I was in these stores, doing field work, observational work, sometimes working behind the counter, collecting videotapes of the interactions, I'm like, wow, most of this stuff is not notable. Or if it was notable how people built relationships, how they built rapport, how they got to know one another through these brief service encounters. And this is way before, this is in the 90s, before we were talking about customer experience. And so that work stayed with me when I went to Bentley University, which is a private business school outside of Boston, and began working there in 1999 and maintained this interest in what we would call ethnographic studies of work, understanding what happens in workplaces between people who inhabit these spaces. And once I found out, and I also teach in a user experience program, graduate program, and once I found out there was a thing called customer experience, and it was through, believe you and Rich, who's on this, had for the Boston meetup, and I just went to a coffee in Boston for the CXPA Boston chapter. And I was like, wow, there's a thing called CX. That's interesting, because I knew about UX because I was teaching that, but I didn't know there was a thing called CX. And that started to get me thinking about, well, this feels more like home because it is so similar to what we talk about as sociologists or social scientists.
So I'm glad there's such a connection, Mark. Thanks for that. What do we've got a poll here, and I think let's run that poll now, because I think they got the juices started rolling here with folks.
I'm not going to be grading this, right?
No, this isn't a test.
Oh, it's not a pop quiz. Okay, because people get nervous when you give them a pop quiz. There are no wrong answers except for the ones we don't like. It's a joke. It's always hard to joke on webinars, don't you find? Because you're waiting for the response and it's like, oh, tough room. It's almost like teaching to a bunch of undergraduates.
You can.
Someone from Grosse Pointe Holler. That's where I was. That's where I grew up for part of my life, was in Grosse Pointe. So welcome in, Andy B. That's exciting.
Okay, are we running?
We are.
Let's see here. Here comes the question. How much do you rely on social science in your customer experience work?
And there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheekness with these responses, because when I meet people and I tell them I'm a sociologist and a social scientist, these are some of the responses I hear, such as, oh, sociology, I think I had a class in that once. So there's that. Or, when I'm at Bentley and I'm at an open house for prospective students, as I was this past weekend, people will say, what does sociology have to do with business? Well, besides everything, so there you get this range of, yeah, I've had it. Oh, yes, it's highly important, to I have no idea. Right. So, but it also kind of digs into the lack of impact that social science has had on people, especially from sociology and anthropology, where we're not doing a good job at talking to folks about what it is that we do and how that can help them.
Would those poll results surprise you, Gary?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's about right, especially for this kind of audience. I think it'd be hard, especially for a CX audience, to think that social science is irrelevant, especially when you consider psychology as part of that, because so much of experience design, especially user experience, is rooted in cognitivistic psychological frameworks. What's often not as focused on are the systems and the larger cultural frameworks. We like to talk about culture. We like to talk about cultural change. We like to talk about organizational change, but really don't tap into all of the work that's been done in anthropology and sociology. So if I would ask a more specific question about what social science, I would guess that most of the time it's psychology, and maybe not sociology or anthropology. Nothing against psychology. I have a double major in it, but I think that there's more that we can understand and use when we start looking at things from more of a systems perspective.
Yeah. I just thought here, it's not likely that social science and what it could offer is really necessarily top of mind to a CX practitioner, because we're wowed by so much technology and things like customer journey mapping, metrics like NPS and other metrics. But what new ideas and possibilities can social science offer to address the more humanistic aspects and make for a more valued experience over and above all that, tools and technology?
Well, I think going back to one of your questions I didn't get to yet, which is what's a clinical sociologist, or what's an applied sociologist? And I am the former president for the Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology, and I kind of answer it in this very quick summary way. If you think about most academics, people who go on and do a PhD and do research, they use sociology in terms of the theories, concepts, methods that we learn as sociologists in sociology school. And the audience for that work, generally speaking, are other academics. So we publish in journals, We go to conferences. We might write books that are pretty dense to read through, maybe published by Cambridge University Press or something like that, where if you read them, you're going, I don't understand a word that you said, and I do this for a living. But the audience is academic. Then you think about, in sociology at least, applied sociology. Now, the way I talk about applied sociology is we're applying those same theories, concepts, methods that we would do in an academic study, but we are translating our findings for a non-academic audience. So I'm applying sociology to help, let's say, an organization better understand the nature of interactions between customers and workers, or better understand how to, like I was at South by Southwest a few weeks ago, how to create better branded experiences through exploring customer culture or social culture. Then we go to clinical sociology, which I'm a clinical sociologist. It's creating or designing interventions, much like any clinician is about intervention, right? I am trying to figure out something to make it better based on my expertise. So as a sociologist and a social scientist, I try to use my expertise, methodological, theoretical, conceptual, to help clients design approaches to improve something that they want to improve, to change something that they want to change. So when we think clinical sociology, it's not medical, it's interventional. It's trying to help create some kind of change, much like Mark was talking about.
Yeah, change is a big deal. And let me ask this question here, because we talked about culture too. What role does the culture of an organization and structure do you think play in shaping customer experiences, and particularly, in relation to, employees, empowerment, things of that nature?
And this goes to a question you just asked me as well, which is what can social science add? And I think the first thing we can add is levels. Okay, so as a social scientist, we might talk about micro, meso, and macro, or the fine-grained, detailed, the mid-level, meso, or the macro, like the big picture. And so when you talk about organizational culture, my immediate question would be which one? Because there might be a larger organizational culture at a macro level that is created through all the cultural touch points we look for when we do ethnographic studies of culture. But then we might find mesoculture that exists within different parts of an organization. So the operations versus marketing versus sales versus engineering versus technology versus HR, et cetera, might have their own cultures. And then you get down to the micro level, which might be teams, or it might be actual touch point and interactions that take place. So when we think about culture, I think the first thing that social science brings is this fine-grained analysis of which level are we talking about and where does that level come from. When I did research on software development teams and in this one major information systems or information services company, we were looking at offices in India, looking at offices in Ireland, looking at offices in the United States. And it might be the default to say, well, it's American culture versus Indian culture. That really wasn't accurate, because in different parts of the United States, different offices have different cultures. And people online might be familiar with this, that the office in Boston might be different culturally than the office in Dallas or the office in Los Angeles or Portland or wherever it might be. And so when we think about American culture, it might not lead us to understanding the pieces that we need to focus on to make that change possible. So the first thing is understanding which culture are we talking about, and then thinking about how we can change that culture at that particular touch point in order to make change happen.
Gary,
Yeah.
I have a question for you about, let's imagine we're starting a brand new company. So there's nothing established already. Okay. So in this scenario, and I want to get your perspective on the relationship between culture as you define it and customer experience as you know it, which is the predecessor of this. If you're starting a brand new company, does customer experience initiate where you are, how you operate, or does culture yet established, from which customer experience then grows? Which one is the core or precursor to creating an ecosystem around customer centricity, let's say?
I always start with employee experience. And I think that if we're using organizational culture as a proxy for employee experience, then yeah, perhaps, right? And I think it depends, because we can start about startup culture. I would kind of need to know the scale, the maturity level, the operational space that the company is in, because tech has a different culture than healthcare. It has a different culture than I don't know, a charter school, for instance. Okay, or et cetera, et cetera. So those industries might have their particular features or characteristics that we need to think about in terms of what are the expectations people in that space have, but also how are we thinking about the the employee experience. I don't know if, and it's not a startup, I don't know if folks saw this viral video going around recently where a CEO of a office furniture company, was basically lecturing her employees about quit complaining that you don't have any bonuses. Go out there and make the sales, keeping in mind that this person had over $1 million in bonuses the same year. It's like, well, what do you do with that? That's clearly culture. And where's the disconnect? Where's the failure? How do we expect people to care about and deliver high level customer experience when they don't feel cared for and they don't feel curated and their experience is lacking? And so I think we always, and this is where me as a sociologist comes in, because this might be where my heart goes, but also I think where the research goes, starting with the employee experience, starting with that culture, thinking about the ways in which we want to create together. And then as it scales, do we lose that? Once we go from startup relationship where the company is driven by relationship to things become more standardized and bureaucratized, do we lose that feeling? That a lot of companies do lose that, right? They lose when they go from startup to a more mature, scaled organization. There can be this sense of loss of culture or transition to a different kind of culture that people might miss and resent.
Gary, to add to that,
So
and
the
to
maturity
address
of
Rich's question over here, I think I had the pleasure of working for an organization some years ago that started without a product or any service in mind, but started as a developed culture. In fact, it was based on a book by two authors, Deal and Kennedy, called Corporate Cultures. You may be familiar with that book. So the organization started with a core of individuals that were all pretty much laid off from another organization. So we're going to start an organization, a tech company. We don't know what we're going to build or serve or offer, but we want a culture that we feel is the right one for us. And I actually was about the, I think, 90th person to join this company. And I had 6 full interviews before they hired me. The first one was, is this person able to handle the business that we think we're going to do? And the other 5 interviews were, does this person fit within our culture? And that was 1984 for me. And by the time I left there in 1994, just to your point, Gary, I think it had scaled to the point where there was enough changeover in the organizations and leadership for that to kind of fall apart. But during those first 5 to 8 years, I got to tell you, what a great way to be employed. I was one of those people that on a Friday afternoon couldn't wait for Monday to roll around. Imagine feeling that way about an organization.
It actually reminds me a little bit of Southwest recently, because, and I've not done a deep dive on this, I just read stuff online and stuff in the news when Southwest was imploding around all the travel delays and all the issues they were having. When you looked at on Twitter, for instance, or other locations where people were posting accounts that were internal, posted by employees, they were saying things like the organization stopped listening to us. They no longer valued our expertise. We could see this coming and try to say something, but no one would listen. And that the leadership of Southwest went from Herb Kelleher, who was, people can argue, very strongly employee-centric, culture-centric, and into more of a traditional organizational management style, which was far less so and was much more top down. And so I'm not saying that was the problem. There was other problems with their systems, but it was interesting to see all of that surface during this time, which speaks to this question of when it was a startup, it had one kind of culture. When it was matured and Herb was no longer there, it created a different kind of culture, different kind of management control system. And you saw the outcomes. One of the things, just really quickly, I was talking with a colleague at my school about this, and they were asking me, well, does employee experience as a class, is that part of like the Department of Management? And I said employee experience might be more about unmanagement than management, right? So I nothing against my management colleagues, love them, mean it, but we can argue that employee experience absolutely should not belong in a management HR focus of education, because it's not about that. It's about other things beyond that, which hopefully, going back to Rich's point, would establish this kind of culture of belonging and inclusion and purpose.
So, Rich, did that answer your query?
Yeah, but it also speaks to the fact that there's so many different variables that go into this, whether you're at a startup, what kind of industry, or you're at some level of maturity where culture is present, whether it's effective or not. If you want to be a better organization, meaning more customer centric, more profitable, good things happen, change, to Mark's point, has to be part of that, or at least a consciousness around what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it through people. Technology is an enabler. And I go back to me being in the banking business. If you go back in time and you think about before technology was ever present, if you were the banker in a small town, what was your role? You were the advisor financially to the townsmen. You were respected because you can help people achieve their financial goals. You knew people. You knew what their challenges were. You knew the names of their family members. Customer experience was the reason you were a professional and could get business. It's just that as that town got bigger and the number of customers expanded, and you needed to create that level of connection more at scale, you needed to have the ability to use technology and better communication so that you lose that personal touch. But you always get back to that relationship, right? If you lose that, then you lose that connection to your employees, to your customers, to your stakeholders, and no tech is going to overcome that. It may enable it in some ways, but you have to have that culture. You have to have that intentionality to create those experiences with design principles in mind. Because if you let it just happen by chance, to your opening point, Karl, things are not going to go as you would like.
And so going to one of the points you made, Rich, is that, yes, there's a lot of variables, and this brings another thing that social science can add to this, which is complex systems, thinking about things as being complex, as a wicked problem, of a manner of speaking, wicked problems being these inherently complex challenges that society faces. And how do we leverage multiple perspectives, multiple areas of expertise, multiple backgrounds? How do we leverage and direct those towards understanding and then trying to solve that problem? And so I think, and as I was recording a podcast this morning on Experience by Design podcast, we were talking about this, and Karl, I know you mentioned this with we were chatting earlier about silos. And, the perniciousness of silos is not just in the fact that people can't communicate, but they can't connect their knowledge bases and direct them towards some of these larger issues. So I think one of the things I like about sociology, I've always liked about sociology, is that you have to be a bit of a jack of all trades and a master of none in that, you have to do a little bit of a lot of different things and connect those pieces together because so much is going on in society. That's another vote for being a generalist versus being a specialist, because thinking in general terms and being able to draw those connections together allows us to, as Rich was talking about, think about the complexity of those variables, but not in a way that makes us feel overwhelmed, but makes us feel empowered to action, because we can actually then see what all the pieces of the puzzle are.
And you must see those silos in academia right at your organization, right?
No, academia is fantastic. There's no silos in academia. It just hasn't changed in 600 years. It's, people are like, oh, academia is progressive. I'm like, spoken like someone who doesn't know anything about academia, because the model is inherently siloed. We have departments organized by professional area of expertise and not around problem areas of study. For instance, what would a university look like if it was organized around areas of study in which people from different backgrounds were working together, versus departments where I might not have anything in common with the person that in my department, other than the fact that we hold a common degree. And so it's inherently siloed and separated.
Gary, that sounds like systems thinking to me.
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit. Again, it's like, as a sociologist, I'm so pleased that systems thinking is now in vogue. I spend most of my time, it feels like, waiting for people to appreciate things that I've studied like 30 years ago, and kind of go, yeah, culture, kind of important. Oh yeah, people, sure, those two. Systems, yep, that matters. And it's not anybody else's fault, but the discipline of the social sciences and sociology for not doing a better job of communicating what it is we know to audience who can use it. That's our fault for sure, because we could have been doing a better job at making those connections, which is why I always feel fortunate I'm at a place like Bentley, where I have the opportunity to do things like this and be able to speak on the relevance of the social sciences and sociology in areas like customer experience and business.
That's comforting to know, because I have systems thinking as a topic within my CX Pro class. So I was probably dealing with some social sciences there a little bit without even knowing it. So
yeah.
What I wanted to ask you, because we talked about silos a little bit, we know they exist in organizations, but one in particular that I'm concerned about these days is the siloization, as it were, of customer experience itself. We see customer experience in the form of departments and functions within our organizations, and I think in some respects they become in danger of being siloed in and of themselves and not being part of that broader system of business. What's your thoughts about that?
One of the things, and as many people on this session have much more direct experience than I do, but as a person who has studied professions and examined their growth and maturity, not shocking, given that CX as a profession is relatively new and it is maturing. And part of that maturation process can involve the domestication of something that was meant to be disruptive. There, you put that on a bumper sticker. And we can start to think about UX did the same thing. UX started out as usability. It was just simply about making things more usable. One of the early episodes on Experience by Design podcast was with Elizabeth Rosenzweig, who was a colleague of mine who was there when usability started and the Usability Professional Association started. And we talked quite a bit about this. And then you look at the concern that as user experience became more professionalized and more accepted in organizations, it actually became infected primarily by a profit motive. How do we get people to not unsubscribe? How do we get people to click on this? How do we get people to order more, et cetera, et cetera? And Don Norman, who was the person who I believe founded the term user experience, he spoke to one of my grad classes once, and he was talking about, I don't want to put words in his mouth, so I'm paraphrasing, UX kind of losing its soul and no longer being about the user, and more being about the profit and the company. So I would ask, right? Are we seeing this here? Are we seeing that customer experience, which was about, the customer, throughout the enterprise, now being more about how do we create the perception of a better experience so that people will buy more, stay longer, spend more, right? I mean, that's a good question. It would not shock me for sure, but that becomes part of that trying to retain its essence that professionals and professional organizations really need to be on guard for, so that it still has what it was originally supposed to be about.
It's interesting thought, Gary. Here, I became aware of this company just recently here called Interface. I don't know if you'd ever heard of them. This is a carpet manufacturer in Georgia, right? And in 1994, their leader started looking at what they were creating from a I guess a waste and climate perspective, and they had this goal to become least carbon neutral by 2000. So that's like what, just a few years afterwards. And so in 1999, they transformed the whole organization to become a sustainable organization. I just looked up this morning, and they're carbon negative right now, looking to be carbon neutral by 2023. And I just wonder, I look at that and I say, geez, would I want to do business with a company like that? Because they're really looking at, the environment. They're really, kind of speaking to someone who feels really, kind of concerned about the environment. How much do you think that plays into the experience that customers would want to have in an organization when they see stuff, when they see kind of progress like that?
It's really funny because on the podcast, we just interviewed the chief sustainability officer for the American Society of Interior Designers. And we talked exactly about this, because he was remarking about how negatively impactful the industry of interior design can be when you start thinking about all the materials that go into an interior design or to a building space. And if you're the designer, right, you're not the customer per se, you're working with a customer who is seeking to have a space designed, decorated, constructed. Are you trying to convince your customer that this is a good thing, that you would go for companies who are carbon neutral or carbon, I don't know if the word is net negative, or, basically it helps the environment through its carbon footprint. Yeah. And if it's cost, or is that cost a driver? It might be more expensive. However, this is a good thing. And, can we turn this into branding? Can we turn this into marketing? Can we turn this into further sales for you with your customers further downstream? I'm old enough to remember that there was this sense that people will never buy fair trade coffee. People will never buy fair trade products. And turns out, lo and behold, they will buy those things, especially if it's egregiously more expensive, perhaps not, but if it's comparably more expensive but better, they will.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, Karl, I think that it needs to be built in as part of the experience, that thinks about, as another term that was referenced, this larger experience ecosystem, that it goes beyond the simple touch point of I'm buying a thing, and it goes into I'm part of environment, a larger environment, that there are other stakeholders, and I need to make that part of my experience as well.
Yeah. I think as the story goes, this organization did actually reduce costs significantly in the process of doing this. So it was kind of a win-win on both sides here. As we're coming down to the wire here, I have one more question. I want to make sure that everybody who's at least on camera here, I see a Jerry Seifert on here. I want to make sure that those folks get a chance to say whatever's on their mind as well. So thank you for being on camera, Jerry.
Jerry's in his best form, and that's muted. There he is. No, I'm kidding. It's a joke.
It's okay, Gary. I'm used to it. No, I wanted to express compliments to Gary because I think the tent of disciplines and abilities that we need to do CX right is got to be a much bigger one than it is today. There are, it seems like I'm finding a new area of expertise every week that, as I sit down and try to reconcile it with practice, it makes me wonder, well, where does this fit? And where does this fit? And every time that happens, I conclude, well, it's got to fit somewhere. It's all about human nature and people and the choices that they make. And so, Gary, thank you very much for hanging out and sharing your expertise. And just be patient. People are listening. But I know sometimes it can be a lonely place to have a message and seemingly people are not paying attention. So,
Thanks for the pep talk, Jerry. And for folks who may not know, Jerry does a great job of connecting people of different experiences and knowledge so that they can be in environments where they can share those things and help each other find solutions, support each other, and just generally be there for one another. And I think, your point, Jerry, goes back to this complex systems point.
yeah,
That there's so much. People are complex, right? So shocker. People are complicated and complex. And again, as a sociologist, people, we study people. And so, I go back to this old adage from Simon Sinek, where he says, 100% of customers are people. 100% of employees are people. If you don't understand people, you don't understand business. Then the last line I add is study sociology, understand people, or study social science, understand people. I mean, this is what we do. We study people. And it goes back to this creating opportunities like this through Question Pro, where we can kind of break down that membrane between the academic and the applied, the professors and the professionals. We can bridge that gap so that we can share with one another and figure out how we can both inform what it is that we do. Because everything, when I talk to folks who are in industry like this, I take that back to the classroom.
Yeah.
And ideally, what I do in the classroom and what I also do in consulting and on the podcast with my co-host, who's an anthropologist, that can be actually applied in a professional environment.
Well, Karl, if I may be permitted one last comment. Gary said earlier something about being a generalist was a cool thing. But when he said that, I thought back to, position descriptions of CX leader roles that I've seen in recent times. You have to have 24 years of NPS experience, 31 years of digital experience.
Was there digital 31 years ago? Do we have that?
It doesn't matter. I saw a spoof of one this week. You have to have 20 years of applied ChatGPT experience.
Yeah.
And it's almost like people are posting leadership jobs that are anti-generalist and rewarding hyper specialization. And yet you're trying to tell all of us that you need to have a more general orientation to knowledge and to the disciplines in order to do the job right.
There's a fantastic book by David Epstein called Range, and and he makes their argument really well, actually, with receipts.
I love that book.
It's a great book, and especially if you're older, like many of us, it's affirming, because the idea that once you get that range of experience, once you get that range of understanding, you can then integrate that knowledge into innovation and creativity. And so when I read it, I was like, yeah, what he said. We're not so bad.
Well, and then there's a companion to it called, I always forget the name. Oh, Karl, what's the name of the book by Arthur Brooks?
Oh, you challenged me here. It's right over there. And I can't say
But
it.
in any event, if you hang around long enough, you find that you no longer make your way in the world by mastering facts, and you have to grow into your wisdom.
Oh, thank God, because I'm horrible at remembering facts. So.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the name of the book. I mean, I've only recommended it like 14
We'll remember
times.
it after the show's over.
Of course, as soon as I hit log off, I'll remember it. But
So-
in any
so-
event, to your point, Gary, hopefully as people grow, that's why I mentioned the thing about the CX leader job description. I host a drop-in group on Fridays for CX people that are looking for work, and boy, I'm glad I'm not looking for work right now, because the things that they say about the position descriptions that they apply for, I mean, it's literally you have to have 31 years of NPS,
Walk on water.
yeah, walk on water, 22 years digital. I mean, it's like, come on, folks.
You know what, Jerry, this is kind of segues into there's a question came in and I want to pop it up on the screen here for Gary. With the emphasis on NPS helping to shift CX away from customer to that emphasis on numbers of business, would the emphasis on NPS help to shift CX away from customer to that emphasis on numbers? I worked for an organization where its total emphasis was on numbers. That's what it's all about.
How much time we have left? 2 or 3 hours?
Here.
So I got definitely thoughts. I'll boil it down quickly, because I actually taught a course I developed called Data, Context, and Information. It was basically a sociology of data and a sociology of information. So, numbers, people want to treat numbers. There are metrics and indicators, right? So miles per hour is a metric. It's measuring a discrete unit of property, right? How fast am I driving or running or bike riding or whatever? What's it an indicator of? What's it mean? When we're moving to perceptual measurement, it's not a measure. It's not a metric. It's an indicator. It's always an indicator. What's it indicate? I don't know. And why I say I don't know, what I mean is that we need to understand the practices that led to its creation in order to understand what that number represents. We all have heard stories, or all have had experience where you're doing something and someone comes over and says, can you please respond to this question? And it would really be helpful if you gave me a 10. Right.
Yeah.
Or if you give me anything below a 9, I'll get fired.
My kids won't go to college.
Yeah. Okay. So, who is doing the filling out? What are the circumstances under which they are filling this out? What's it really represent? And even with numbers that we think are hard numbers, like, crime rates, Uniform Crime Index, or UCR, Uniform Crime Reports, that's just a reflection of police reporting practices. Mm-hmm. Unemployment isn't a measure of unemployment. It's a measure of unemployment reporting. So that's the first thing. It doesn't mean they don't tell us anything, but it does mean that the numbers don't have a concreteness that we attribute to them. And so this is where, rather than throwing out the NPS with the bathwater, because people do like their NPS, and I would hate to take away their binky, we say, okay, what else can we do along with that would help us triangulate our understanding and employ, and this is where I start to sound like a professor, a mixed methods approach that would help to increase the reliability and validity along with the authenticity and trustworthiness of the data set that we're compiling, so that we make sure we integrate qualitative and quantitative, because qualitative data is actually data, okay? And then we can have a multidimensional understanding of the thing we're trying to understand. Agreed.
The triangulation of insight. If you see patterns around, is it a 10 for NPS? Is it a 10 for level of effort? Is it the verbatim comments that says how easy it was to do that thing? If there's alignment around all of those measurements, then you think that that person felt it was a pretty good experience. But if you're just relying on one number without context, you're subjected to the vagaries of what that measurement really is trying to drive.
And I think on that point, Rich, that, working with a company like Question Pro, not just around, we want to implement this survey or have this dashboard, but like, what are we really trying to understand? Like, what are we really trying to get at? And working with a trusted partner who's not trying to sell you on a solution because that's the solution they have, but really helping you develop a strategy and a philosophy around what this data represents, what even data means. It doesn't mean you have to take a graduate class in methodology. Thankfully, you have people like me who did that for you. But it does mean that you can sit there and say, what's the thing we're really trying to capture? And how might a solution like Question Pro help us with that, along with other things we might already have, right? So that it's, we can leverage what we have once we understand how valuable it is. And sometimes it takes working with a partner to be like, oh, we can use that. That's great. And we can help you with this other piece you are looking for in ways that you might not have expected. But it takes people, going back to the original point, it takes people being willing to change. You can't expect to have differential outcomes if you keep doing the same things. It just doesn't happen. That's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So it does take a little bit of a leap of faith to do behavioral change, but that has to start at least with, hopefully, a philosophy, a willingness to change. And once you recognize you have to have a willingness to change, then it's about how do we work with people who can be change partners, who can help me understand what is required so that it's not just buying a new bathroom scale or buying a new survey, but it's about buying that new bathroom scale, getting that new survey, but with a different mindset that is, not just human-centric, but humane-centric. And I just created this. I just jotted this down. What's the difference between human and humane? Well, you add the E, and that is experience.
Oh, I like that.
So in other words, Gary,
Wow.
Mark needs not only a scale, but an accountability partner.
Well, or a scale that will lie to him. I mean, that would be the other service level I would add.
No, that doesn't
Is that,
help.
do you want the honest scale or the dishonest scale? The dishonest scale is going to cost you a little bit more, but it's going to make you feel a lot better about yourself.
Exactly.
Which, guess what? That's what NPS often does.
Yeah, I was going to say, we already do an awful lot of that.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that interesting? We started with the scale and we ended with the scale.
You'd think I almost do this for a living, Karl.
It's almost like we planned this. And my big takeaway here was, it's like an epiphany. NPS isn't a metric; it's an indicator. Boy, I have to change my language in my course and my book and everything here.
You're welcome. That's why people don't like sociologists. So, you just ruined everything I thought I knew, and now I hate you for it. But I just rather ignore you.
Yep. Well, you know what? We are at the end of our time here today. Gary, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great having you here. How can folks get in touch with you, and how can they know and follow your blogs and your podcasts?
Yeah, there's a few different ways. One would be Experience by Design podcast, where we explore experience designs of all kinds. We're available anywhere you get podcasts. If folks are interested in speaking with me directly, there's the LinkedIn. You can also go to Gary@GaryConnects.com. I do professional speaking. If you're looking for someone to talk to the people in your organization, or you need someone for any kind of program, always happy to talk with you about that, to carry hopefully some of this collected wisdom. I actually have a birthday in 2 days, Karl, so I'll be 1 year wiser and 1 year more achy as well.
Oh, we should have had this next month, not this month.
No, I know. I might not be here that long. They're starting to accumulate. So Gary at GaryConnects.com, Experience by Design podcast, or at the LinkedIn that's in the chat, Gary C. David on LinkedIn. You can find me there as well.
There you go. Well, thank you, Gary. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in here. Rich, Mark, and Jerry, and anyone else on here who submitted a question. And we'll see you next month. We'll see you on, let's see, when will that be now? May 16th by my calendar here. May 16th. May 16th. Let me look up here and see what we had on May 16th. Our guest will be Rick Denton. He's a podcaster of his own. So if you know Rick.
Do know Rick.
Yeah. Yeah,
great.
So he'll be our guest, and he will be talking about stop surveying and scoring and start listening and acting.
There we go.
How about that for a topic?
Love it.
Thank you, everyone. Take care and enjoy the week.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, guys.